The Legge Show for the week of Georgia's game with the Gators, and this one is a pivotal one for both Georgia and Florida. Obviously, the Gators have a tough close to the season. They still have to play Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida State, and it's going to be tough for them to win all three of those games for sure, and it may be tough for them to win any of them. Georgia comes into this game as a 2.5-point favorite. After a week off since they last played, they lost to Vanderbilt the last time they were on the field. And then there's been a lot of discussion about how that game went down. Certainly the officials had at least some role in that. I think has become clear over time. But Vanderbilt gets the win nonetheless. First time they've beaten Georgia and Nashville in 2 decades. So this past week, South Carolina tripped up Missouri, who did their best to collapse and choke a job, and left the East wide open for everybody else, considering Missouri's end of the season schedule, which has Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M on it. So Georgia and Florida will try to claw their way back into the East race. Georgia's already beaten South Carolina. Florida will try to do that in a couple of weeks from now. Both Georgia and the Gators are going to have to probably win out to win the division. And that's possible I think, for Georgia. For Florida, that's a tough task. They got to go to Columbia, and South Carolina's played pretty well there through the years, for sure. And then, you've got Missouri. If they don't lose again, then they'll win the SEC East. And really, they only have one loss, so there's no reason they couldn't still win the national championship. But that team we saw Saturday night, that wasn't a very good performance, and that's a pretty monumental collapse. And I think they've left the gate open right this second. It seems like this is, believe it or not, South Carolina's in the best position just because they play their next 2 games at home, one against Mississippi State and one against the Gators. But Georgia's in the middle of it too. If they, assuming Missouri loses 2 more games, which is a pretty big assumption, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibilities at all, considering who they're playing. Georgia's got the toughest. On paper, is probably a trip at Auburn. Georgia's beaten the Tigers, I think, 2 years in a row in lopsided fashion. But Auburn is a different Auburn than they once were. So, with that, we'll get straight to the questions in this pivotal week of Georgia's game with Florida. This may sound like a silly question, UGA Dog Forever 08 asks, and I don't think it is a silly question. He says, but how much better does Todd Gurley make this team? The answer is a lot better. They've won 1 game without him in the lineup. They won 15-2 with him in the lineup. So, 15-3. So it's not that hard to know how good Todd Gurley is. He missed a decent portion of that Clemson game, and he missed the whole second half of the LSU game. So Todd really has only played a full game against a legitimate foe once this season. That was against South Carolina. Obviously, he missed the Vanderbilt loss. He missed the win over Tennessee and the loss to Missouri. Easily the Vanderbilt game would have gone Georgia's way with Todd Gurley in the lineup. And it'd be hard to think that they would have lost to Missouri with Todd in there too. So my opinion is he's the best running back in the country. And if you can have the best running back in the country play for your team each week, you'd rather have that than him not playing for your team. So Georgia will have the benefit of Todd Gurley coming back, and I think it makes Georgia a completely different team, just completely different team. SwannyDog03 says, what do you expect Mark Richt to do in the offseason to correct special teams mistakes for the 2014 season? I would say that he is going to have to make sure guys catch the football. I mean, that's it. You just can't drop balls on the 10-yard line and expect to win football games. It's that simple. It's not more than that. Everybody wants to scream and yell and say, Georgia needs a special teams coordinator. No, Georgia just needs guys to do their job on special teams. It's very simple. Just catch the ball and place it where it needs to be, whether that means that you're about to punt it, whether that means you're about to catch a punt, whether that means you're securing a snap, whether that means you're snapping the ball. The issue is that. Other than that, the special teams really have not been that bad. I mean, go back and look. The PATs have gone well. The field goal unit has performed pretty well. They performed an onside kick and gotten that back. but there's just been too many lapses by guys that perform on special teams a lot, and particularly snappers and holders and punters. The problem with Georgia is special teams, for sure. But at the same time, do you go out and hire somebody to make sure someone catches the football? I mean, look, the kid's got to just do it. You got to catch the football. It's that simple. New question here from someone I don't quite know how to pronounce. The Paul Dog Jr., I guess. Do you think strength and conditioning has anything to do with the amount of injuries? It's a long, really long question. It goes on to say, have you heard any concerns about this before, talking about injuries? Georgia needed a strength and conditioning overhaul going into the 2011 season, and they did. They got that. And I think what we've seen ever since then is Georgia's program has gotten better. Now, the main reason why is because they had better players. But they needed a change in strength and conditioning, and they did that. It was something that enhanced player performance, and I think you've seen that over the last couple of years. No, that I'm aware of, there's nothing that strength and conditioning is doing that is increasing the amount of injuries Georgia has. Now, it's possible that on Thursday lifts, they could be isolating and doing too much lifting on a particular part of the body, i.e. the area around the knee, but that's not what I hear. I mean, that would have been different. That if they're doing that this year, that would be different than what they did last year. So I think what we've seen is, unfortunately, some freak injuries. And I mean, I've covered Georgia since 2001, since Mark Richt's first year, and I've never seen anything like this. This is as bad as it's ever been. And if you look at the injuries, you've had Todd Gurley with an ankle, Josh Harvey Clemens with a foot, Trey Matthews with a hamstring. Now, once you see a bunch of hamstrings, you sit there and go, well, is this guy in condition? In other words, are their hamstrings where they need it to be? And you see the hamstrings is two new guys, Jonathan Rump and Trey Matthews. They've not played a college football season yet. So those two guys had those things. Obviously, earlier in the year, you had a couple of outside linebackers with thumb issues, broken thumbs. And then there have been an MCL with Michael Bennett. I mean, that's, what it wasn't an MCL. It was something, I can't recall what it was now off the top of my head. A multi-week injury, but not a season-ending injury. And then they've had a slew of ACLs. But does it have anything to do with strength and conditioning? No. Not that I'm aware of. And I've heard nothing on that end that makes me think there's a real problem with strength and conditioning. Strength and conditioning has gotten vastly better at Georgia than what it once was, and I think that's why they perform so well when they're not injured. But look, this is one of those games where Georgia can have the ability to set its season going forward the right way. This has been a rough month. October was a rough month. Period. If Georgia played like it did in September, they'd be in the national championship hunt. But in order to play that way, they got to have their key guys. And now some of those guys are not coming back, obviously. But hey, they've got what they've got now, and the Gators are hurt. I mean, they're banged up big time. So Georgia's just going to have to make it work. But I don't think it has anything to do with strength and conditioning. And if it did, I would say it. I mean, I was one of the more vocal people about how strength and conditioning was a disaster in the late 2000s, because it was. It needed a change. It needed a refresher course. They got that, and I think it really helped. Mark Richt was quoted Tuesday about Trey Matthews' injury, saying that the more he shows he can do in practice, the better chance he will have to play. Does Richt have you have to practice to play rule, or if he or any other player for that matter is cleared for the game day but unable to practice during the week, would he end up playing? I think the thing that Richt is saying there, and then my experience playing sports in college was that if you can't practice, you probably just cannot play. It's that simple, and it doesn't mean guys are trying to dodge practice. It just means, like, literally, if you can't press off and jump, or if your arm only goes so high. I had an injury one time in college where I couldn't raise my arm above this, this high. I couldn't go up like that, and I just couldn't go. And it's just all there was to it. So I think that it's just a matter of practicality. I think Mark Richt's critics at times have points because everyone is has faults, but the problem is that Mark Richt is too practical, and if you can't practice for a week, then you're going to be not necessarily in game condition. And what we've seen with Todd Gurley is he's slowly gotten back to the point where he can play. If he had played against Vanderbilt, he would have risked being injured again with a high ankle sprain. Isaiah Crowell never got past the high ankle sprain that he had in 2011. He just never did. And then if you can't practice, that means you're not getting anything close to game speed, so you're going to be out of condition. I mean, you're not going to be able to go full blast when you need to. So I think that's a lot of it. I think that's the big thing. Why does Georgia? This is kind of the old. Well, here's another one here from Pastor Phil. Do you think Todd was able to stay in football shape such that he can play physically to withstand 20-plus carries after being off for a month? I think that's definitely a good question because I don't see how you could really be in football shape with not playing or practicing. But now he's been practicing for 3 weeks. He just has not been able to practice well enough to play in a game. I think if Georgia had played this past week, he probably would have played. They had it off, so it looked like it was possible he could play against Vanderbilt, but that was like on the 10 to 15% line, and it just wasn't really practical in any way. You don't want to take. Todd Gurley is going to be back for the rest of the season. Georgia still has 5 games to play, and they could have a lot. They could have 7 more games to play. You don't want to throw the whole season away just so Todd Gurley plays against Missouri or Vanderbilt or Tennessee even. You want your best guys in position to play, and that's when they're healthy. And the fact of the matter is that some of these guys just were not able to perform, whether it's Michael Bennett, Chris Conley this week, Justin Harvey Clement, Justin Scott Wesley's gone for the year, but guys like Trey Matthews and Josh Harvey Clemens, et cetera, et cetera. Georgia's relatively healthy on defense coming into this game. They're going to miss Toby Johnson, but other than that, they'll have the usual group out there. Now we'll see what it's like when Georgia actually has this 2 starting safeties in a game. I think they've only played together 3 times. What's it going to be like when that secondary really settles down and you're not having Quincy Marger and Connor Norman rotating in and out like they've had to do? So that's a good question. But I do think with Todd, I think Todd is in a little bit better shape than he would have been typically just because he's been able to practice. But there's no way if you took off a month and you kind of rocked out eating pizza and drinking your Diet Coke that you could come out and perform. It's just impossible. But the thing that people should, Georgia people should be excited about at least is that A, he's in the game, and B, that he's been practicing. So that's a good sign. J.M. Toll Dog says or asks or states, and then he goes on to point some things. Mark Richt has at times appeared exhausted and emotionally spent this season. He seems a bit more grumpy this season. He's been at Georgia for 13 years now, and I don't expect him to leave for another job, and I've never got the impression that he wants to coach into his 60s or 70s like Bobby Bowden. Do you think he will retire soon? Do I think he will retire soon? I'll start there. No, not necessarily. It depends what you mean soon. He's been in Georgia for 13 years. I think he'll probably be there at least another 5 to 7, something like that. I don't really know what Mark wants to do in the end. I think he's doing what he wants to do. Having dealt with recruits and the families of recruits during that rocky time in 2010 and 11, they would say to him, well, what would you do if you got fired? And he would say, well, I'd go coach somewhere else. So I think he is passionate about football. He's a football guy. If you want to talk about what's going on in Washington, D.C., or if there's a federal shutdown, or if there's, how many people live in New York City, or what the state capital of Wyoming is, he might not be the guy for you because that's not what he does. What he does is football and guiding young men. And, I think you saw at the graduation rates and the APR and all that stuff this past week. This is what he does. And he does it very well, actually. But the Georgia fans at times do not appreciate how well he's run Georgia over the last 13 years. And that's it's not sad. It's just it's how it goes. That's the way that college football is these days. But is he exhausted and emotionally spent? It's been a rough year. If Georgia were 6-1, it would be a rough year. You can't play all these games and they all come down to the fourth quarter, with the exception of the North Texas game. You can't see guys work for 12 months and then see their season go away on one play and not think about the times that those guys were working out and sacrificing and going to class just so they could make sure that they were getting ready for this fall. You can't think about all that stuff and not know what's going on. And then we never know what's going on in Mark Richt's personal life. I mean, he's not like a lot of people. He really is private. He's a private person. And, he has kids that are that one's graduated from college and a couple are still in high school age and one that's in college in Nashville now. And, we have no idea what is going on in his world. But the big thing is that this has been the nuttiest season I've covered Georgia forever, it seems like. And this has been easily the nuttiest season Georgia's had in the time Mark Richt's been around. And frankly, the guy before that was Jim Donnan, and they just didn't have seasons like this back then in the 90s. And they just didn't have, years where you'd beat 2 top 10 teams and then you lose to Vanderbilt. Those days, it's a little bit like the 1991 team, but not really. This has been a season that, Georgia could have won a national championship this year for sure. But when you just see player after player go down, it's hard to watch. And I think that for him, knowing those guys vastly better than any fan or member of the media does, that's hard for Mark. So, yeah, he's definitely been emotionally spent. I don't know if he's been exhausted. It depends on the day. All right, Danger Ranger 6969 asks some old fun ones here. Number 1, do you think John Fabris would come back to coach special teams? No. Number 2, does it seem like Georgia has more recruiting misses than most schools in the SEC? Definitely not. I don't know if you've paid attention to some of the other schools that have not recruited as well as Georgia. Part of the reason why Georgia fans ask these sorts of questions is because they know Georgia and they know that they're familiar with Georgia not signing Alvin Kamara, but they don't realize that Alabama didn't sign Bryce Ramsey, right? So it's the same sort of thing. Does Georgia have a curse on its sports like South Carolina's chicken curse? No. The chicken curse is alive and well in Columbia, and that's not changed. And there's no sort of chicken curse mentality in Athens. Georgia just has a high-level athletics department, and when you're good at a lot of stuff, you're going to lose games that are televised very high, you're going to lose in spotlight games sometimes, whether it's women's basketball, tennis, or football. But no, a program that has multiple national championships and college or conference championships, there's no curse on Georgia. No way. Why doesn't Georgia have 20 football advisors like Alabama? I think that's a question for Alabama more than it is for Georgia. I'll leave it there. Why does Georgia continue to play the Florida game in Jacksonville? I don't want to hear tradition as an answer. Well, that is the answer. For me personally, Jacksonville's fine and everything, but I don't think it would hurt anyone's feelings if the game were played in the Georgia Dome, which will needlessly be knocked down here in a couple of years. But in a stadium in Atlanta, I mean, I don't see what the difference is personally. I mean, so now I can say this without Georgia's won the last 2 games in this series. It's split the last 6. I'm just saying this has nothing to do with Georgia winning or losing the game. I mean, why couldn't you play it in Atlanta? I mean, I don't think there's any reason why it's got to be played in Jacksonville, other than it always has been played in Jacksonville. I think the coastal Georgia community really likes it down there. Obviously, there's a lot of people. South Georgia has really, really great Georgia fans. I mean, they're probably better than any other group, but that supports Georgia. But I think that, and they feel like this is their one home game a year. I mean, people that live in Savannah, which is not really South Georgia, but people that live in Savannah, Valdosta, Tifton, uh, Camden County, Brunswick, that area down there is hard Georgia. I mean, they really love the dogs and everything. And it's always been in Jacksonville, and it probably always will be in Jacksonville. Um, but it's a great question. I mean, I don't think they have to play that game in Jacksonville by any stretch. Every time I go down there, it costs me about $600. And I mean, if you're looking at it from a purely selfish standpoint, the state of Georgia should want that game versus uh, Jacksonville and the municipality of Duval County. You're losing a lot of tax dollars down there for that game being played down there. And I mean, the city of Atlanta would, I'm certain, love that game. Put it like this. This is one thing about Jacksonville. Georgia's game with Kentucky is about as close logistically in Lexington. It's about as far from Athens to Lexington, about 6.5 hours, as it is from Jacksonville to Athens. So now it's further to Kentucky, but still, think about that. That's how far Georgia goes down to play the Gators. It's a long way away. But once they get on the field, it's irrelevant. Behind the scenes, it's a Florida show. I mean, nobody that's not behind the scenes doesn't see that. I mean, Florida's sports communications runs the deal. People who normally are able to go onto the field ahead of time, beat writers and so forth, they can't get onto the field because it's Florida's policy. It's definitely still it is different. It used to be the Gator Bowl, and Georgia's not the Georgia Gators; they're the Georgia Bulldogs, and so things have changed over time, and that's gotten a little bit better. And I think if it hadn't, Georgia, said, "Listen, we're not doing this anymore." But it's just like if Florida came and played the game at the Georgia Dome, they could say this sort of same thing. But look, it's a great rivalry. It's a classic American rivalry. It's there's really only one other thing like it in sports, period, which is Texas and Oklahoma. But those two schools, for years, if you've not read what I wrote about the importance of the Florida game with Georgia, you really should. But for years, for decades, that Texas-Oklahoma game had nothing to do with the conference championship. They weren't even in the same conference. So this game with Georgia and Florida is really a big deal. Always has been. It always will be. Doesn't matter if they're good or they're not. I mean, in 2010, both teams were bad. I mean, bad. Right now, this year, they're both riddled with injuries. I wouldn't say they're bad. They're just stuck in injury mode. And, last year, this is a matchup of the number 2 team in the country against the number, I guess, 10 or 11, whatever Georgia was at the time. And I can assure you it'll be just as loud Saturday as it was a year ago or as it was in 1980 or 1996. I mean, so it's one of those games where this is the reason why the kids go to those schools. And, if you're orange and blue, you're on that side of the stadium. If you're red and black, you're on that side. And if you sprinkled in there, I feel bad for you because I've been in that stadium and it's nuts. It's a lot more civil than it used to be. I'll say that, but you don't want to be in red and black in the orange area and your team lose. That's not a lot of fun. And I think for the last couple of years, it's not been a lot of fun for any Florida fan to be down there. But it'll be a critical matchup for both teams. I think the loser, it's almost impossible for them to win the division at that point, and therefore the conference. And it's been a long season for both of these guys. It's about to get longer for one of them on Saturday night. all you want to do when you're playing in Jacksonville is have the lead when the cops come onto the field with their giant Jacksonville horses and they're sitting over there in the corners waiting for the people to riot. But that's what you want. You want to have the lead late, and Georgia's had that the last 2 years, and that's really helped them. The return of Todd Gurley this Saturday in Jacksonville, Georgia and Florida. Stay tuned.